In the final, desperate months of the Third Reich, hope was a commodity measured in gallons. Gasoline was the lifeblood of the German war machine, and by the spring of 1945, that blood was running dry. For the elite Panzer-Lehr Division, one of the last remaining armored fists in Hitler's arsenal, the promise of a swift, decisive strike was evaporating with every mile their thirsty tanks consumed.
But on a nondescript stretch of road in central Germany, a discovery was made. A cache, a bounty, a staggering 50,000 gallons of pristine fuel, seemingly abandoned by the retreating Allies. It was a gift from the gods of war, or so they thought.
Our story unfolds in the first week of April 1945. The location, the forested, rolling terrain near the town of Bad Langensalza, in the heart of the crumbling German Reich. The unit, the Panzer-Lehr Division. Though battered and depleted from the Ardennes and the Western Front retreats, Panzer-Lehr remained a formidable force. Its ranks were filled with veteran officers and instructors from Germany's tank warfare schools. Its equipment, though not at full strength, included a core of the deadly Panther tanks and Panzer IVs. Their mission, under the overall command of General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, was part of the fragmented last-ditch defense. Intelligence suggested a vulnerability. A spearhead of the U.S. Third Army, advancing with characteristic speed, had potentially overextended its own supply lines. For the commanders of Panzer-Lehr, this presented a fleeting opportunity, a chance to launch a localized counterattack, to hit the Americans hard, to stall their advance, and to buy precious time. Time for what? Few dared to ask. But in the twisted logic of the war's endgame, any successful action was now hailed as vital.
The plan was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Consolidate the division's remaining operational armor. Move under cover of darkness to a forming up point, and then, at dawn, strike like a dagger into the flank of the advancing American columns. But there was one all-consuming problem. The Panthers, the Tigers, the armored personnel carriers, they were all gasping, running on fumes. The elaborate German fuel production and distribution network lay in ruins, pummeled by strategic bombing. To move the division even 20 miles was now a logistical nightmare. The attack was stillborn before it could be ordered.
On the morning of April 6th, a reconnaissance patrol from the division's Pioneer Battalion returned to headquarters with electrifying news. They had not found the enemy. Instead, they had found salvation.
In a small camouflage depot just outside the village of Weberstedt, seemingly overlooked in the American advance, sat row upon row of 55-gallon drums. American drums, marked with the familiar star and the classification 80-octane gasoline. Preliminary estimates suggested a stockpile of nearly 1,000 drums, over 50,000 gallons. It was a volume of fuel the division hadn't seen in months.
The report raced up the chain of command. Initial jubilation was tempered by caution. Could it be a trap? Was it mined? A detailed security sweep was ordered.
Engineers meticulously checked the perimeter, the drums, the ground. They found nothing. No explosives, no signs of booby traps. The fuel itself was tested.
A small sample was drained, its clear, high-quality liquid poured into a can. It smelled correct. It burned with a clean, hot flame. It was, by all accounts, perfect. The division commander faced a monumental decision. The fuel was there, his tanks were not. To retrieve it, he would need to commit his few remaining fuel Bowser trucks and every horse-drawn cart and capable vehicle he could find. It would be a massive, all-day operation, dangerously exposing his limited logistics in daylight. But the prize was irresistible. With 50,000 gallons, the Panzer-Lehr Division could not only execute its planned counterattack, it could operate for weeks. It could become a true mobile reserve. It could, perhaps, change the local course of the war.
The order was given. Operation Tankard was initiated. Throughout the afternoon of April 6th, a bizarre convoy snaked its way from the division's hiding places in the forests toward the depot at Weberstedt. Prime movers, Opel Blitz trucks, even commandeered civilian wagons joined the slow procession. The mood among the crews was one of disbelieving optimism. For the first time in weeks, they had a tangible reason for hope. By 1600 hours, the first trucks were being loaded. Heavy drums were rolled and hoisted onto beds. The work was grueling, but undertaken with a frantic energy. As the sun began to set, over 300 drums had been secured.
Back at the division's lager, mechanics began the careful process of refueling the Panthers. The potent, sweet smell of gasoline filled the twilight air.
The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost dismissible. A crew chief from the 2nd Battalion, refueling his Panther, noted his engine seemed to be running rougher than usual after topping off the tanks. He assumed it was just the cold of the evening. Then, a Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun, its engine started to move it into position, suddenly belched a cloud of thick, black smoke and died. The driver cursed, blaming poor German manufacturing in the war's final days. But then the reports began to flood in, not from one vehicle, but from dozens.
At 1830 hours, a Panther tank of the 1st Company, its engine freshly filled with the captured fuel, shuddered to a complete stop just 200 meters from its assembly point. All attempts to restart it failed. The engine was locked solid. By 1900 hours, over 15 major armored vehicles were reporting catastrophic engine failure. Not just sputtering, but total mechanical seizure. Panic, cold and insidious, began to spread through the command posts. Engineers and mechanics swarmed over the stricken beasts. They drained fuel lines. They checked filters. What they found was horrifying. The fuel was not pure gasoline. It was, in fact, a diabolical mixture. American logistics units, aware of the German practice of scavenging, had begun a policy of fuel doctoring for depots they were forced to abandon in rapid advances. To the 80-octane gasoline, they had added a precise percentage of a viscous destructive compound, sulfur dioxide. To the naked eye, to a simple flame test, it was undetectable in the mixture. But inside the high-performance, precision-engineered German Maybach and HL series engines, it acted as a corrosive poison. As the fuel passed through the fuel pumps and injectors, the sulfur dioxide began to break down, forming sulfurous acid. This acid attacked rubber seals, corroded delicate metal components, and, most critically, when exposed to the extreme heat of combustion, it left behind solid, abrasive deposits of sulfur. Inside each engine, it was as if a million tiny pieces of grinding sand were being circulated. Pistons scored cylinder walls. Bearings were ground to dust. Valves seized in their guides. Within minutes of operation, the engines were literally tearing themselves apart, from the inside out.
The scale of the disaster became apparent. The Panzer-Lehr Division had not found salvation. It had willingly, eagerly, pumped a slow-acting poison into the veins of its own armored corps.
By midnight on April 6th, the division was in a state of paralysis. Nearly 40% of its operational armor was now completely immobile, with engines ruined beyond any field repair. The remaining vehicles,
Those that had not yet been refueled were frozen in place, their tanks nearly empty. The great counterattack plan was not just canceled, it was now physically impossible. The division's combat power had been halved not by enemy shells, but by its own hands. Faced with this unprecedented calamity, the German command exhibited both desperation and ingenuity. The immediate order was to stop all use of the captured fuel, but the damage was done. Now they had to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their own mobility. The turning point was not a heroic charge, but a grim, heartbreaking engineering triage. Master mechanics and engineers worked through the night by lantern light. Their goal was not to fix the destroyed engines. That required factory-level rebuilding. Their goal was cannibalization. Any Panther with a seized engine was stripped of its ammunition, its radios, its machine guns, and its crew. Those weapons and men were redistributed to create reinforced infantry strongpoints.
The few remaining operational vehicles, those that had run on the last dregs of their old clean fuel, were given a new pitiful role. They were no longer the spearhead of an attack. They were now static pillboxes.
They were carefully towed using the last precious drops of uncontaminated fuel in the recovery vehicles to key intersections and defensive points on the division's perimeter. There, they were dug in, their hulls partially buried, their tracks removed to stabilize them. The mighty Panthers, designed for blitzkrieg, were reduced to fixed fortifications.
The solution was a confession of utter defeat. The 50,000 gallons of fuel, still sitting in hundreds of drums, was now a toxic asset. In a final act of bitter irony, orders were given to use it as a defensive weapon. Pioneer teams rigged the remaining drums at the depot with explosives, creating a massive fuel-air explosive trap for any pursuing American forces. Other drums were emptied into ditches and streams, creating flaming moats in front of the new, static defensive line. The elite Panzer-Lehr Division, Hitler's fire brigade, had been transformed overnight from a mobile panzer force into a bogged-down, immobilized infantry division with a handful of embedded tank turrets. Their hope, their last spark of offensive potential, had been extinguished, not on the battlefield, but in their own fuel tanks. The aftermath was swift and brutal. When elements of the U.S. 11th Armored Division approached the Bad Langensalza area on April 9th, they expected a fierce counterpunch from the renowned Panzer-Lehr. What they encountered instead was a stiff but static defensive line. The dug-in Panthers and assault guns inflicted casualties, but without the ability to maneuver, they were systematically flanked and destroyed by more mobile American Sherman tanks and tank destroyers.
The division's defensive stand was brave, but ultimately futile. Within 2 days, their positions were overrun.
Many of the veteran crews, now fighting as infantrymen, were killed or captured. The material loss was catastrophic. Of the division's remaining armor, historians estimate that over 30 major armored vehicles, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns, were lost directly to the effects of the contaminated fuel, destroyed where they stood, or abandoned during the retreat. It was a loss from which the division could not recover. There were no medals awarded for this disaster, no citations for valor in the face of mechanical betrayal. The story was buried in the chaotic collapse of the Reich. It only emerged later in Allied intelligence interrogations and the memoirs of a few surviving division engineers who spoke of the American fuel that turned to sand. The legacy of the Weberstedt Fuel Depot is one of psychological and logistical warfare at its most subtle and devastating. The Allied doctored fuel tactic was a masterstroke of deception, targeting not the soldier, but his machine, not his courage, but his means to fight.
It magnified the German army's greatest weakness, its crippling fuel shortage, and turned their desperation against them.
For Hitler's last hope, the final slim chance for a localized armored miracle on the Western Front, it was the end. The 50,000 gallons didn't just fuel their tanks, it fueled their final, fatal miscalculation. The war in Europe would end just 1 month later.
This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story where the tide of battle turned not on a beachhead or a battlefield, but in a quiet depot with a silent corrosive mixture in a drum. Subscribe to the War Archives as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.